budget surplus. And then, so that's just something that's exciting this legislative session. And I think I'm particularly excited about MHP's agenda and how that's progressing this legislative session. We've been calling for $2 billion in spending or funding to Minnesota housing now for 2 years, about $1 billion in production and $1 billion in what we call access and opportunity. And that's really progressing. There's been hearings for a bonding bill that would invest $1 billion in bonds divided between housing infrastructure bonds and general obligation bonds that would maintain public housing. And Annie will get more into that when she gives the Homes for All update. Our bill that we've been working on to provide state matching funds for local housing trust funds, that was heard very early in session and has met deadlines. So that was a relief. 40 tax relief is something now that both the Senate and House have heard and has been laid over for possible inclusion to the tax and the property tax omnibus bills. Source of income protections has now been included in both the House and Senate tenant omnibus bill packages. And I hope Annie will also touch on the tenant omnibus bill package that's new this legislative session and how they're thinking about moving a package for tenant protections forward to the Judiciary Committee. Bring It Home. There's been a lot of coverage on Bring It Home, the campaign for universal rental assistance. That was a part of both the House and Senate joint caucus priorities this session, and we've heard it highlighted by lawmakers at rallies and different events and in the media. And so we're excited about the opportunity to see a significant amount of funding going into rental assistance this legislative session. And then we also know that funding for naturally occurring affordable housing acquisition and preservation is a priority of Chair Howard. So we anticipate that will receive funding. And it's also part of the governor's budget request. And lastly, on MHP's agenda is funding for the Family Homeless Prevention and Assistance Program that's really targeted at emergency rental assistance. We have been working diligently to get a bill moving before those budget targets come out. The legislature has taken some action on funding packages before the committees have their budget targets, where they're seeing there's an immediate or urgent need, and we are making the case for that need for emergency rental assistance. It's I think my definition of emergency and urgent seems to be different than lawmakers, that sometimes the process at the legislature can seem excruciatingly slow when we're talking about programs like FHPAP that can help prevent evictions, prevent homelessness by keeping people stably housed. That bill, fingers crossed, will be heard in both the Senate and the House on the floor next week, meaning it could go to the governor's office to be signed into law, and those funds could get out the door within the next, I hear, 2 weeks. So very excited about that. We know that there's a House floor session that's been scheduled, but we're still waiting on confirmation about a Senate floor hearing scheduling. And so as we wrap up, I'll provide an action alert on how you can engage us in that. I'm just looking to see if Amy is on, and if not, I will turn it to Annie. Annie, are you prepared to go first? I know that she's on. She was on. Let me apologize for this delay. Amy is having issues entering the Zoom. Annie, okay, I see you on camera now. Can I turn it over to you, Annie, at this point? Okay, great. So Annie, again, is one of the co-chairs of Homes for All. Michael Dahl is another co-chair of the policy committee, and he's on the call as well. Annie is also the advocacy director at Minn. And so excited to have you here and give us an update on what's happening with the Homes for All agenda.
Hi, everyone. Sorry, I was just finishing a call with the senator. So I apologize for my little bit of delay. As Libby said, I'm Annie Shapiro. I'm the Advocacy Director at Minnesota Community Action Partnership and also one of the policy co-chairs along with Michael, who you can also see. I do have slides, but I decided I don't want to use them. I'd rather just kind of share where things are and then take questions. I know Libby had some questions prepared, but also happy to take questions from folks in the audience. Feel free to raise your hand or put them in the chat. I know Libby said to put them in the chat, so happy to take questions however it makes sense. Libby kind of gave an overview of where we are in session and where targets are landing and how things are going. So I'll just kind of focus in on some of our agenda items in particular. The first thing that I want to say is that we're really excited. I think Michael and I are both very excited that agenda items on both our coalition-led agenda, which for Homes for All this year were kind of issues that raised to the top in terms of usually pressing needs or things that needed to happen more immediately. So both the coalition-led agenda and our member-led agenda items, all of them are happening and moving really well. We've been getting hearings, both the House and the Senate, on a variety of bills. Basically, everything has been moving in really positive directions. Hearings have been going really well. We're really excited about it. I think it, in both kind of the more DHS-related pieces, which are pieces related to people experiencing homelessness, services for people experiencing homelessness, and then also in the Minnesota housing space. And so we're really excited about that. We think it's there's really momentum behind a lot of our bills. We think that there's definitely opportunity to move a lot of these pieces forward, especially some of the pieces that we've kind of been waiting for a while. So I want to highlight a few specific pieces, and then I'm happy to talk about specific bills in addition. In addition to what Libby mentioned, I wanted to highlight that this past Monday, in this House, they heard a bonding bill that included $72 million in general obligation bonds. So that's basically like how you would spend on your credit card kind of bonding for rehabilitation for public housing. We're really excited about this. Our coalition is asking for about $250 million for rehabilitation of public housing across the state. Public housing doesn't receive funding from the federal government to do a lot of rehab. So a lot of the housing is really unsafe or really unstable. And this funding is the way that the state helps those public housing authorities and public housing be as safe and stable and reliable as possible, and also ensures that we keep that public housing in the state. If we lose the public housing, we don't necessarily get it back. And so we're really excited about that. We know that there's going to probably be another bonding bill as well. So we are hopeful that that number won't be the final full number, but at least we're excited to see that piece moving. In addition to the emergency rental assistance, which Libby mentioned when she was sharing her thoughts about kind of where session is, we're also working on another bill that has been flagged to be fast-tracked that's called the Pathway Home Act. And it's a kind of, I'm going to call it a minibus. So it's not a full omnibus bill. It's about $250 or so million that goes towards a variety of programs and services for people experiencing homelessness and for shelters. And the shelter providers, we've consistently heard that if they don't receive the funding kind of more immediately, they will have to close some of their programs. So that has been passed off the House floor 2 weeks ago, a week ago, I don't remember, a week ago. And we're just waiting for a Senate hearing to kind of move that along as well. So in addition to the emergency rental assistance that Libby outlined, that those are moving really excitingly, hopefully next week in both chambers, we're kind of watching and waiting for potentially that same bonding bill to move in the Senate and then the Pathway Home Act. In addition, I just wanted to highlight that we're having some really exciting conversations about all of these funding bills, but as Libby mentioned, there's a lot of conversation also about policy bills. And we had a hearing yesterday in the Senate about basically what will be a tenant rights omnibus. Again, omnibus usually refers to funding, so just the large tenant rights protection bill that includes a variety of provisions that our coalition has been working on and folks on this call have been working on for many years. So it's very exciting. Some of the pieces include things like eviction expungement, the source of income protection that MHP has been leading on for many years around making sure that people with vouchers aren't discriminated against when they try to get housing. There's heat codes, there's a variety of really amazing and in some ways really game-changing tenant protection laws included in that bill. And so we're really excited to see kind of how these pieces are all coming together. I think I'll stop there for now, but happy to answer more questions. And that's kind of just a general overview of where we are. So if you have specific questions on bills, I'm happy to answer those as well.
Thanks, Annie. And again, as a reminder, if you have a question for Annie or for any of our speakers today, please feel free to put those into the chat. Annie, are you hearing anything about or speculation about those budget targets that we have been told will come out on the 20th?
Yeah, so I think that it is a challenging landscape and that there's a lot of money, but there's also a lot of funding priorities. I think there's a few things that are complicated. The first is, I think there will be more money in housing than there has been, but I'm not certain that it's going to be $3 billion. In fact, I assume it probably won't be $3 billion. But I think we can try to push a little bit to get it as high as possible. And then the second is on the DHS side, it's complicated because DHS, as many of you know, funds a lot of programs and big programs like Medicaid, right? And so we don't ever want to pit housing against things like Medicaid, like SNAP, or anything that helps with food assistance, any other programs that impact people who are also housing unstable. And so it's really thinking about how to get a really big target for DHS so that we don't pit these issues against each other. And the fact that the Minnesota housing budget also will help people have high educational attainment, have better health outcomes. And so I think it's it's a challenging space in that we don't ever want to pit our issues against, like, please do not fund housing and then don't fund food shelves. That doesn't make sense, right? Like those, we should fund both. But how do we kind of ask for this really big target has been something a little challenging. Does that make sense?
Thanks, Annie. I know that I have two more questions before we bring in Amy, but one is the $72 million in general obligation bonds that was included in the bonding bill that House passed. I just want to, the Senate Republican caucus made an announcement that same day that bill was dead upon arrival, and the Senate does need some Republican votes for that bill. I'm just, can you talk though a little bit about, was there a plan? Is there a plan to get that number up to 250 now that they're going to have to kind of rebuild the bonding bill? Or thinking at one point I had heard maybe there'd be two that move through session, one a little bit earlier, one a little bit later. I don't know, Annie, if you can give us any more insight into the bonding bill and what that means for those GO bonds for public housing.
Yeah, so we had heard that there were going to be two. So this one that was passed on Monday in the House was theoretically supposed to be the first tranche of a very big bonding bill that would be split into two bills. The question becomes, if the Senate can't or won't move early, do you just create one larger bonding bill at the end of session? And so I think based on our conversations with Representative Lee, who's the chair of the Capital Investment Committee in the House, he was not saying that 72 million would kind of be his ceiling. It was just his starting place for GO bonds for public housing. And so I think the question now becomes, do we try to push this one through now? Do we try to increase the amount for the final bonding bill if there's just one at the end of session? And I think it's kind of a wait and see game for the next couple of weeks to see if the Senate actually holds out, and then figuring out how to make sure that that is increased, because he had kind of said earlier that it would be much higher between the two.
Thanks, Annie. And I'm going to pivot to Amy Koch now, but I don't know if either you or Michael could answer in the chat or provide a little bit more detail about what is the plan for that tenant omnibus bill. the Senate sent it to Judiciary. The House will take it up on Tuesday, but do we have any sense of whether or not the Judiciary committees are actually going to take that up? And is their plan to roll it into their omnibus bill, or is it going to be something that is completely standalone? Again, if you could maybe just give a little bit more detail on that bill in the chat, that would be appreciated. So next, we're going to hear from Amy Koch, who is a political strategist. You probably see her on lots of different programs commenting on what's happening at the legislature. She's a former majority leader in the Senate, and she's working with MHP this legislative session on our very bold, ambitious agenda, including the constitutional amendment and $2 billion for housing. So we want to welcome Amy, and I really wanted Amy to kind of bring in that Republican perspective, that former lawmaker perspective about what is going on this crazy busy legislative session, and how does housing really fit into all of that?
Great. Well, good morning, everyone, and thanks for having me, Libby. I tell you, if there's ever a session for bold and big, this is the session for bold and big. So way to go, MHP. Very early before the session started, Speaker Hortman was asked, she asked about what she foresaw for this session. And she said, well, the young kids use the term LFG, which means you really want to get going very quickly. That's not what LFG actually stands for exactly, but the sentiment is true. And boy, howdy, does this legislature believe it. It started January 3rd, and it started with just like a rocket ship, and it has not slowed down. There's a couple reasons for that. A couple of reasons are you have the trifecta. You have the DFL House, the DFL Senate, the DFL governor with a real opportunity to push through that through with an agenda. Second of all, you have a couple last few sessions where very little, because of the divide, very little was done. And so you have sort of a backlog. And then third, you have, almost an $18 billion surplus, on top of, money that has been spent in excess in the last two sessions, money that was put into the savings account, all that on top, all the money that came in for infrastructure from the federal government, not included in that $17.6 billion surplus. So those combined for the perfect storm of a very, very busy session. And so what you've seen actually is, well, first of all, you hear a lot about the backlog of bills. That's because of the great number, but it's also because some really massive, high priority, like sort of campaign promise bills have been moving forward first and foremost. And just as an example, in the first week and a half, they pushed through a tax conformity bill. Tax conformity sometimes is a negotiated thing at the end of session. It was done in the first week, which, accountants across the state rejoiced. And then they moved into big bills like driver's license for all, has been passed, signed into law by the governor. Restore the vote has been passed, signed into law by the governor. The Crown Act, codifying abortion rights, adding state inflation to the state forecast, a food shelf funding bill, just really big, sort of the campaign priority bills that have passed. Addition to that, many bills that have not been finalized yet, but are massive, have been moving through the system. An example, you've probably heard about the paid family leave bill, not finalized, hitting some roadblocks along the way, but it has been moving through many, many committees. Cannabis legalization, it needs 14 committee hearings in the House alone. And so cannabis has been moving, again, hitting a few snags, but that bill is huge, and it's taken a lot of air and committee time. In addition, and folks, Libby has hit on these a little bit already. The Pathway Home Act, which was sort of that minibus bill on homeless funding with capital, shelter capital. There's been 2 to 3 childcare funding bills. And then there's been this small, we're calling it the small bonding bill. About $1.9 billion, mostly GO bonds, but a good chunk of cash. And so that bill passed out of the House last week. with a strong bipartisan support, which, by the way, the bonding bill is the only bill that requires that that supermajority. But it got it, and it got more than it needed in the House. It's hitting the rocks in the Senate. The day of the vote of the House floor this week, the Senate GOP, which they will need a handful of those votes, said it's not happening over here. I think that the Senate DFL may force a vote. This is going to be interesting to watch. They are keying it up. It's teed up in Senate Finance today, so it would be ready for the floor as soon as next week. I think that there'll be some questions on, like, sort of, how do you do this? Do you want to bring it and push it and see if you can sort of force Republican votes? There is a tremendous amount of money in here for Republican districts. That's a big part of why you had the strong GOP vote. That cash bill in it, the 300 and some million, is divided 4 ways. Each caucus gets an equal share of that. So it's very much a compromise bill that was left over from last year. And then in his addition, as you spoke, as we talked about, there's a look to what we're calling the big bonding bill, which would be all cash at the end. One of the options, if this bill does not pass, is that all of this money, the 1.9 billion, could be all cash. And Speaker Hortman has made it clear that she is open to that option. But I would just point out, it's not a great option. There's a lot of money on the table, almost $18 billion. But some of the roads and bridges and infrastructure that they would normally bond for, if you take that cash off the table, it takes from other priorities, right? So a bonding bill, and by the way, we also have a lot of bonding capacity in this state. We have a AAA rating. We're really doing great. This is actually, it is, I think, important and okay to leverage, particularly for these projects. And without those Republican votes in the Senate, it can't get through. And so, so that's kind of, there's a couple things that the DFL are weighing on that big bonding bill. Maybe I'll stop there and see if there are questions, just so I can see how people want to go.
Thanks, Amy. And again, I'm going to remind folks, if you have questions for Amy, please put them in the chat. So Amy, things have been busy. They've been moving things. As you said, these are more campaign promises that the DFL trifecta has moved forward. Why is it taking so long to get things like FHPAP to provide emergency rental assistance, something that has Senate and House support? There's some Republican support, or the Pathway Home bill, which I think that came out maybe the second week of session. Why are these things, which have very small targets, especially that FHPAP bill is now reduced to 50 million. What's the holdup? Why can't we get these through more quickly?
Well, so they were held up by all those big campaign promise bills going through. They also are being held up by the Senate. And I don't want to besmirch my Senate colleagues. It's really not that. The Senate is a different, first of all, so it's for a variety of reasons. One, there are just simply less senators. There's half the senators. So there just aren't the number of senators to work on these big bills, right? So you might have 2 or 3 champions of the Pathways Home in the House. You have one person working on it in the Senate, Senator Dibble. And by the way, he's also transportation chair. So they're spread much thinner. There's a much closer vote count there. While there's about 5 seats in the House, there's 34 to 33 in the Senate. That's a 1 vote margin, which means every DFL senator is a bill maker or a bill breaker. And then the third thing is they're just new to it. The majority switched this last election season. So you've got new chairs, you've got a ton of new members, but you've got a lot of new chairs, some that have held gavels before and some that haven't. And so where the House has been had worked on these bills, they actually voted for many of these bills off the floor over the last couple of years, the Senate hasn't. And so you're seeing a big bottleneck in the Senate. And now for FHPA and for Pathways Home, we're going to hit the budget wall now, right? So by April 4th, they have budget deadlines that they have to get their omnibus budget bills. They don't even have their budget targets yet. We're hearing by the 20th. And then they've got to scramble around and get that massive budget put together and out of committee by April 4th. They've set themselves some very aggressive deadlines for the budget. And so now what's going to happen is that budget is going to happen and kind of stop kind of a lot of these things. However, the good news is for those bills, they've been heard, and they would likely, at the worst case, if not passed early, be included in omnibus bills. So.
Well, thanks for that. And I'm just going to put in a flag. We will have an action alert slide at the end of this this call for folks to make phone calls to their lawmakers on that FHPAP bill, because yes, we wanted it included in the final omnibus bill, but that's where we want to see kind of permanent, ongoing funding to that program. Whereas the bill that we're trying to move forward is to provide that emergency rental assistance to people. Evictions are at all-time highs. They're above. February was 65% above pre-pandemic levels. So I'm gonna put that out there. So
yeah, focus on that Senate, folks, and those calls do make a difference. So please do. The calls make a difference.
If the Senate forces a vote on the bonding bill next week, is there any hope that that would pass, or is it truly dead on arrival? And if it is dead on arrival, I mean, are you optimistic that they can come back and put together? We see this oftentimes. The House will put together a statement bonding bill, it'll fail, and they'll come back and they'll renegotiate. I mean, what are your thoughts on bonding?
So there's going to be a lot of pressure on the Senate GOP, especially after the House voted and in such a strong fashion. I think they were trying to sort of maybe almost scare the House off by putting out their press conference. I mean, that's right. They'd be like, yeah, it's not, even when it comes here, it's dead. But, and because they have a lot of projects in there, and it's going to be very hard for them to say no to a bill that their House counterparts said yes to. And, highways through their cities that they've promised that they would support. So I think there's a chance that the pressure gets there. I also think from a Senate GOP perspective, it is the only bill where their vote truly matters this session. And I think they're seeing it as potential leverage, and to kind of give up the only leverage they have in March feels, like politically not the best thing to do. So, I don't know if I'm a betting person. I think it's probably 70-30 that it doesn't pass the Senate. And of course, there'll be a lot of, that's it, we're just going to do cash, we're done with this. But ultimately, the better end result would be to have these bonds, a large section of these projects be bonded for. And so I think that they would come back after cooler heads prevailed and in a couple of weeks and say, okay, how do we revamp this? That's often what happens. We need a blow up and destruction before everybody can get to the table and be super serious.
Well, thank you, Amy. And I think just to highlight one of the things that you've said, but just to maybe make it a little bit more clear for folks. So if GO bonds don't have a path, so we're not funding public housing through a traditional bonding bill, that will mean if Chair Howard and Senator Port and Chair Port get let's just say a $2 billion target, they now will have to spend that as part of their target, meaning there's less money for other high priority issues. And the ask from Homes for All again is $250 million. So that would be a significant reduction in where they could spend on other priorities. I'm still not seeing any questions. So one thing, just Amy, there's a lot of talks about taxes and no new taxes, and there's DFL members who feel the same way this session. Do you think with the priorities that are out there and what we're hearing about spending, is that possible to do, or will they be looking at raising revenues? And I know that there's going to be several bills that move forward that are looking at raising revenue for housing in the tax bill. Do those stand a chance? Any insight into what might be new revenue available either for housing or other things?
Right.
With the landscape.
I mean, it's tough, right? Because the headline this session is there's almost $18 billion in surplus. And so for the average voter, which will put the pressure on these legislators, particularly in the Senate where you have a 1-vote margin, any kind of revenue raiser is difficult. I think an out-and-out tax increase is tougher than some fee increases. You might see some of that, right? Some exchanging of revenue raisers that look a little different than a tax. Those have a better shot. But it is a tough year. And it's because it's, this is always difficult because yes, we have a lot of money now. A good deal of it is one-time money. And, as things change, these kind of things that we prioritize can miss out. But I think this session, just politically on either side of the aisle, it's going to be difficult. But the governor proposed, so we'll see.
Well, thank you so much, Amy, for joining us this morning. Great to see you. I am going to turn it over to our legislative panel. Senator Bolden, I don't believe is on quite yet. So we're going to start with Representative Agbaje. So I want to welcome Representative Agbaje. She is the vice chair of the House Housing Committee. She's also an assistant majority leader, as well as a co-chair of the POCI caucus this legislative session. So welcome, Representative Agbaje, and I'll just turn it right over to you.
Great. Thanks, Libby. Hi, everyone. Really great to see all of you on today. So I was asked to kind of give a little bit more insight as to what's happening in the legislature as it concerns various housing bills that are going around and coming up. I think many of you saw that at least the House side, we did pass the Pathways Home bill a couple of weeks ago, which was chief authored by Representative Keeler. So really grateful to her work there to continue to make sure that the work on preventing homelessness and supporting those who are experiencing homelessness right now does not fall by the wayside. So that was really strong work to put that $150 million into shelter support. I wish Senator Bolden was on because then she could give me the confirmation if it's done in the Senate or not yet. But we're hopeful that it will be finished and that will be something that will go out quickly to folks. I was listening to the earlier part of the conversation with Amy, and I think the FHPAP funding, that's what's up next on deck, and so we're really working hard to make sure that that gets through. I think it's moved a little bit further in the Senate than it has in the House, but we did hear it in Ways and Means about a week ago, and we are just looking at when we can schedule it. And so I'm hoping that that will come up soon. It's something that, we have found support with the administration to be able to move those funds quickly. And that's something that we continue to press upon our colleagues in the administration to release any funding that they have, or if they need funding appropriated from us, we try to move it as quickly as we can to support those who are, especially renters, who need their rent paid. And that's something that is really important for all of us, because we all know that being stable in your home leads to so much more success in a variety of other areas that a family needs. And so we're continuing to push on that. We're continuing to work hard. We hope that will, whenever it does come up for a vote, that will hopefully be pretty smooth. We are still, if anyone's been following the committee hearings, we are still hearing a number of bills around funding, both in the renting space and in the home ownership space. We really want to make sure that we are addressing needs across the spectrum. And so making sure that people can stay in their homes, and then making sure that people have the opportunity to buy a home if they want. We also have some policy bills around that too, trying to make sure that we're starting to even out the playing field in a way, so that people can be more competitive buyers if they want to purchase a home. And so we're looking at ways for that. And so if you guys have ideas of ways that we should be thinking about it, please let us know. I think we're kind of open to a lot of innovative ideas right now, things that maybe haven't been tried before, or maybe they were tried, but we didn't get a lot of good data or something. So we just want to be as creative as possible, because we know that addressing the housing crisis is going to take all forms of intervention to make sure that people can stay safe and stably housed. And then we are, in terms of the tenants' rights space, both the House and the Senate, I think the Senate had their first hearing yesterday. There's a tenants' rights package that we're putting out together. And so the bill got posted on the House side last night. And so what we're hoping is that we'll have an opportunity to do kind of a package of a lot of tenants' rights bills that just haven't been done in the past number of years. And so hopefully that this can be the year that we can get that going. And so we'll see how that moves, but we're really excited about that package, because finally addressing some things like 14-day notice, making sure that people aren't discriminated against because of if they're using Section 8, And then also just ensuring that the court process is a little bit more fair, particularly to renters. So that's kind of what's been happening on the legislative side. From a POCI caucus perspective, we're really glad to continue to see funding going towards homeownership, funding going towards keeping people in their homes. One of our things is really ensuring that people are stable. So then that way, as we are pursuing some of our other priorities in education and in capital investment and in entrepreneurship, particularly for Black and Brown business owners, it's good that they have a place that they can call home at night, that they can come back and rest and recharge. And so we're hopeful that these provisions and this funding towards keeping people housed will start to go out sooner rather than later. But we're doing our part to continue to work with leadership, work with our administrative colleagues, and continuing both in the House and the Senate to put forward bills that really support and elevate Black and Brown Minnesotans, particularly in the housing space. So, and with that, I'll open for any questions, I guess.
Thank you. And again, please post questions in the chat. And I did get an update from Senator Bolden. She is stuck presenting a bill. So if she is able to join, she will certainly join us, but she may not be able to join us this morning. So Representative Agbaje, as a member of leadership, and as things are being talked about at a higher level in terms of budget targets, I'm curious, I know everyone wants to be really optimistic, but do you think you're going to get $2 billion this legislative biennium? And do you think you're going to get anywhere close to $1 billion in the tails or in ongoing permanent funding?
Oh, I hope so. I think if you've talked to me or Chair Howard or Chair Port or even Senator Bolden, all of us will tell you that the amount of funding that housing has received is, I'll just say it, it's criminal. We haven't invested in this area. We haven't done the work that we're supposed to do. And, I'm glad that the governor's budget had an additional $500 million. I think that's a wonderful first step, but it continues to not be enough to at least start to meet the needs that we all know about. They're not secret needs. So I am really, really hopeful that leadership understands the crisis that we're facing and how far behind on the crisis that we are. And I hope that they take our suggestion that we are able to start to make a real dent and real progress. And then that it's also sustained work through the years from now on. So yeah, it would be amazing to get a $2 billion budget. I think that would be great. I hope they could do more. I don't know if they would, but I think that is at least a baseline probably of what we need. I mean, if it were up to me, I would probably shift things around differently, but at the very least, I think we at least need to show that this is an area that we're finally going to start doing strong investments in. And I think we need to think seriously about how we continue to fund housing. So that way there's dedicated revenue sources for it as well.
Yes, and MHP is very focused on getting that sustainable, ongoing, dedicated revenue for housing. So Dave Dunn asks, how can we help you and your colleagues make the case to leadership for those high budget targets? And how do we ensure that housing, unlike other years, didn't get a lot of lip service in the beginning of session and then kind of get negotiated against as those budget targets came out?
Yeah, I think as Amy said, those phone calls work, right? And so for any of you that have any connection, especially if you have a direct connection to any of the leaders in both the House and the Senate, pull on those strings and make those calls. I think any, sustained efforts by the coalition too, to say that, this is something that we really care about. And I think also one of the things too is I feel like people sort of forget what it was like to be precarious in their housing. And so I think kind of just continuing to remind people that for a lot of folks, housing has never been stable. And part of the reasons why we see so many of the disparities and so many of the social ills and so many other areas is because people don't have a place to call home. So I think continuing to make that case to folks is helping. And I know that that's helped us definitely in this year. people seem to get a sense of understanding that, that this is something that we should be investing in. So I think continue to make those calls. I think continue to show up. We've had a couple of housing committee hearings where we've had a lot of people. So I think, one of the ones, maybe we find a day where we just kind of flood the Capitol with folks. And I know we did that with Homeless Day on the Hill on, what was it, Tuesday? And it was great just to have all of those people in the Capitol advocating for housing. So I encourage people to continue to do that.
Well, thanks for that reminder. And there is a Bring It Home rally on March 20th, and then MHP is coordinating a Day on the Hill focused on the constitutional amendment campaign that we're working on. So go to our website for more information about those. Those are days where we will be showing up, certainly. So there's a lot of housing champions on the tax committee, and I think it's important to talk about the tax committee. There's a lot more resources in a normal session where we don't have a $17.5 billion surplus. And that's also where we can get some of that dedicated revenue. What are the conversations there that are happening in terms of, is dedicated revenue really on the table this legislative session? And how can we engage in that space where a lot of us haven't typically engaged?
I mean, I do think it's definitely on the table for conversation. We've seen, at least I personally have seen 3 ideas around dedicated revenue. And so at least we're talking about those. I don't think we've heard any of them yet, but I'm hopeful that one of them we might actually hear. And so I think it's a real conversation that's happening. In terms of it happening more publicly, I don't think we're quite at that point, but I encourage people, please keep sharing those ideas of ways to raise revenue for housing or find those accounts that we can use for housing. I think all of us working together can kind of figure out what that pathway forward looks like. And there doesn't have to be one. I mean, what I've learned in my 2 years here so far is there are some groups and some issue areas, they have multiple streams of income, and we can also have multiple streams of income. So I think that's something that we just need to continue to put some movement behind. I think we're working hard to find those places, but if you guys and other experiences that you have can know programs that maybe we should be emulating that are specific to housing, we want to hear it. And I saw something in the chat about manufactured housing. Yes, we actually are. We have done a number of bills on manufactured housing on the housing side this year, or in the Minnesota House side this year. We're hoping that we can put together some type of bill for a lot of those issues that we've heard. So we know that that's something that's really important, especially to a number of the members on the committee and a number of members within the caucus that want to make sure that we're addressing the needs of manufactured homes as well.
So Michael Dahl asks, our calls to our own lawmakers and asking them to talk to leadership versus us making calls to leadership, or as individuals making calls to leadership. What's more effective? Does my lawmaker relay my message to leadership to fund affordable housing, or do they keep that to themselves? How does that work?
I guess it depends on the lawmaker. I mean, I do. I try to talk to, well, I also sort of have a different role, so I have a better opportunity to talk to leadership. But yeah, I do talk to them about these issues. And I think some of our other members do too, based on the types of relationships they have with our legislators who are in leadership. So I think that's something to do. And I think to the extent that you have your own individual relationship with them, please utilize that too.
I think Dave Dunn asks a good question. For so long, we've been in divided government. And so we've been thinking about what are these bipartisan arguments to raise the profile of housing. But with the new trifecta, and especially there's a lot of new lawmakers, are there new arguments that you're hearing that are really resonating above others?
Yeah, I think what tends to resonate with folks is the more we connect it to other issue areas. I think a lot of people sort of feel like, oh, once you have your house or your apartment, like you're all set. We need to really think about how these kids are doing in school, and do they have the resources, and do people have access to healthcare? But I think people forget that housing is actually really foundational, and that it's not just something that just happens to people. Like people actually have to there's been a lot of barriers in place historically that have prevented people from housing. There's been a number of barriers that have a number of government policies that have been used to really keep people out, not only of just the wealth building, but also to, really harm those communities. And so I think the more that people can continue to say, like, look, I know you really care about transportation, but what does it mean if, someone doesn't have a place to live, or they can't get from, home to work or home to school, and kind of just tying it that, like, having housing like undergirds transportation. Same with healthcare, having housing undergirds healthcare, because people actually are healthier when they have safe and stable housing. Same with education. Kids, you can give kids all the tools in the world, but if they're hungry and if they're tired, they're not going to be able to utilize that. So as much as we're advocating for investments in education, we need to be making sure that our kids are also safe. And so I think the more that we have been tying housing to these other issue areas that get a lot more recognition in the media, I think that's starting to resonate with folks of like, oh, right, that makes a lot of sense. Like, of course you would have a better outcome. So I think that that's working. Another piece that, I'm also trying out too, is a lot of people will ask the question, because I come from a perspective of, I really put renters and tenants first, of like, well, what about the landlords? What about the property owners? They're trying to make money. And it's like, well, you have to have renters to be able to make money. So at a certain point, you've got to figure out, do you want to chase all your renters away, or do you want to try to work with them to continue your business? And so I think that's something that's also kind of starting to be tied together of figuring out kind of that economic argument of it.
So one of the things I wanted to ask you is, so we're super optimistic there's going to be a lot of money for affordable housing this session, a lot of money going into development. That's especially with that one-time money and things like housing infrastructure bonds. Are you looking at policies that would make deploying those resources more easy? So I know that the Housing Committee heard a bill from Representative Elkins earlier this week, and that moved to state government, I think. But some of those are intended to make sure that it's easier to utilize the resources that we have, and make sure that I'm curious if any of those things are moving forward. If it's not this session, are there opportunities next session on some of the policy ways that we can address our housing needs?
Yes, I think that's part of the reason we had that hearing with Representative Elkins' bill, is to really put it out there that, there are a number of barriers to entries that cities are doing, whether consciously or not. And so I think part of it, part of what he has in there is a lot of zoning changes. So that way, statewide, we have more opportunities to build, especially if it's communities that need more of that dense housing, building more duplexes and triplexes and multifamily homes. And then also ensuring that, single family homes too aren't like taking up these huge lots. And so I think his approach, which he's changed over the years, is really to try to just get cities thinking more broadly about, what are the barriers to entry that they're putting up, and how can we start to take those down? As if anyone watched the hearing, there was a lot of opposition to Representative Elkins' approach, but then with the approach that Representative Norris had, which is also a needed approach of, let's just fund everything, we saw a lot of support for that. But I think what's happening is, we have a caucus now that's really, yes, we need to fund things, and we need to invest in things, and we need to put money into things that we haven't before, but we also need to make sure that people who are receiving that funding, they're held accountable, and they're held accountable in a way that they're not just either holding on to the money or making sure the money goes to the same groups, same organizations, same constituents, but really that it's being open more broadly to those who didn't have access to this before. And so I think, that's what we're working on. Those are the types of conversations we're having. Those are the types of policy and funding bills that is my understanding that we're going to be working on putting together, that those accountability measures are there. So that way more people, whether you are a developer, especially if maybe you might be a BIPOC developer, you can have access to those funds, because usually sometimes those people are the ones wanting to create more dense housing and wanting to create it in communities that have been under-resourced, or that if you're, a nonprofit landlord, that you're making sure that you are addressing the needs of your renters. And then similarly for those groups that are providing support to people who want to become homeowners, that they're providing that support to Black and Brown communities that were shut out of home ownership. So those are the types of things that we're talking about to make sure that there's some accountability in addition to the funding.
Well, thank you so much, Representative Agbaje, for being with us here this morning. And I apologize that it wasn't this open dialogue between Representative Agbaje and Senator Bolden, but that was so much great insight and information. And it sounds like you are going to be incredibly busy the rest of this legislative session, as well as there's going to be opportunities next year. This is not the only year that we're going to be talking about housing, but there's
I really want to like highlight that. Like, I know everyone is super excited for year one, but it's a biennium. We have 2 years. We have another year to try, to continue, not even try again, but to continue the efforts that we're doing. So, I hope people see this as just the beginning, and that, year two, there'll be more to come.
Well, thank you so much, Representative Agbaje. And I'm going to just put up real quick an action that we would like you to take for everyone. Let's see, I'm going to go to the next page. Please call your lawmakers and ask them to pass the funding for the Family Homeless Prevention and Assistance Program and to support $2 billion to Minnesota Housing. $1 billion in one-time funding and $1 billion in ongoing permanent funding to Minnesota Housing. If you don't know your lawmaker, there's a link there, but you can also just Google who represents me, Minnesota, and usually the first thing that pops up is this link. And again, calling your individual lawmaker does have an impact and how they engage with leadership and the messages that they relay. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us this morning. And we'll be having another one of these calls further into session, and look forward to you joining us later in session for another update.